Welcome to the ALI-CLE webcast, Estate Planning for the Family Business Owner, 2023. Our first session today is, Where Do You Want to Go? Finding Your Process. Biographies of all faculty can be found in the course materials. If you have a question for the faculty during the program, please enter it in the on-screen question box and click Submit, then Return. A series of prompts will appear on your screen during the presentation. Please click on these prompts to verify your attendance for credit purposes. At the conclusion of today's presentation, please stay online to complete the survey and obtain your attendance certificate. We will now begin our program.
Well, good morning, and thank you for joining Brad and me in our presentation. We want to begin our discussion by just introducing ourselves very briefly and talk about how it is that we got to have this subject on succession and transition planning. So, Brad, why don't you talk about succession solution and how you got started there?
Sure, Gene, thank you very much. But let me begin by thanking you, the panel, for inviting me to speak this year. You know, I've gone to this program for 5 straight years, and it was a real honor to be asked. I'm only disappointed that we didn't get to go to those real attractive places we've gone in the past. So first time I get to speak, it's virtual. But, my background, I was a former CPA for EY, practicing lawyer for 30 years. And what I witnessed was so many business owners struggling with succession. And so about 10 years ago, I developed my own unique succession planning process. And I have used it successfully with lots and lots of clients. I started a separate consulting firm to help businesses because it's not really pure law, as well as a certification program from other advisors. And in 2019, I wrote and published a book called The Succession Solution. So this is my passion, Gene. I may not have read every single book on succession, but I'm getting close.
But no, and it's been a pleasure working with you because you have given me a laundry list of books to read. And so my entry into this area has been from the pure legal standpoint in working on the tax planning side with families and the estate planning side where it's slowly involved. And I've had the pleasure and the honor of being invited into those families to help with their succession. And as we move forward, the whole reason we're doing this panel is because of the problems with sustaining generational wealth. And it's interesting, when you look around the world, this isn't an American problem, a US problem, but it's a worldwide problem. And it's evidenced by the fact that all these different companies or countries have these proverbs that indicate that there's a problem with sustaining wealth. And, a proverb is simply a pithy statement of some truth. And so, again, what you realize when you begin looking at this, it's not where someone is from. It's a worldwide problem. So it ultimately gets down to being a people issue. So, Brad, why don't you talk a little bit about some of the statistics?
Yeah, and I think many of us have seen these statistics, whether it's the Family Business Institute or other research, that it is really, really hard to transfer a business down to the next generation. And these statistics indicate that an overwhelming majority, 70%, fail to make it even down to the second generation. But I also think it's important to realize how important or how difficult it is for any business to succeed. I did some research the other day, and the average span of a company on the Fortune 500 in 1958 was 61 years, right? In 2020, the lifespan of a Fortune 500 company is 18 years, right? It's really, really hard. I think one of the reasons it's so difficult today and with family businesses is not only the failure to plan, but innovation. So it's not just a family business issue, it's just a business issue.
No, and that's interesting. And oftentimes we're presented with these statistics and we talk about this drastic 70% failure rate. I spoke on one of these panels. Actually, it was the first time I spoke with ALI, and my co-panelist, who was a succession planner, said, yeah, but I think you have to look beyond the numbers. And so as I began to look beyond the numbers, and I think what she was really getting at is the fact that not everybody wants their wealth to transition or their business to transition. And so when you look behind the numbers, it's about a 30% that say they really don't want to pass their business on to the next generation. So what that means is about 70% of family owners or generation one or whoever is controlling the business would like to see it pass. So then when you begin looking at that, of that 70%, about 43% are successful in the process, and 57% are not successful. So when you step back and look at the overall numbers, basically you have 30% who don't want to sell, 30% who succeed in transitioning, and 40% who fail. Still, a majority of those businesses aren't able to successfully transition, even those that want to.
Yeah, and so we talked about numbers and we get overwhelmed with numbers, but I do think it's important that we look at the research to figure out what can we do as advisors. And if there's one slide that I would ask the group to focus on, it's this one, right? So there was a book called Preparing Heirs. And these two gentlemen studied 2,700 family businesses that had net worths over $15 million. That was 20 years ago. And they demonstrated the same failure rate of 70%, 30%, 10%, that the wealth or business was gone. And then they said, okay, why? Why did it happen? Here's the interesting part, and let me work in reverse order. It's not the lawyers and it's not the CPAs that are getting it wrong, because 15% of the time or less, it's due to a technical, tax, financial, or legal issue. 60% of the time, it's a lack of communication and trust. And I don't mean I can't trust Gene to hold my wallet. It means, hey, Gene, will you have that report on my desk on Monday? You say, yes, yes, yes. Monday comes along. Where's Gene? Oh, he's out golfing. I can't trust him. I can't rely on him. 25% of the time, it's an ill-prepared successor. We didn't prepare the person that's going to take over, and he or she fails. So the point is, it's in bold red, 85% of the time, it's a people issue. And I tell the business owners I work with, you're in control of that. You can identify and help train, and you can open up those lines of communication. So this is a really, really important, I think, slide. So, this is the one that, drives me a little crazy. And a number of years ago, I met with an advisor who told me, Brad, succession planning is three things. It's the transfer of knowledge and skill, the transfer of management, and the transfer of ownership. And oftentimes it has to take that sequence. It's not your estate plan. It's not selling your business. It's not putting your assets in a trust. Those are components of a succession plan. Can an estate plan screw up a succession plan? Absolutely. But it's really the transfer of these three things. And then you move over to the right side of the paper and say, okay, do I have my will right? Should I put it in trust? Should I sell the business? But if someone were to ask me, what succession planning is, I think it's those three things on the left side.
Yeah, and one of the things I had added as I thought about it, and that is it's the power of the story. And I messed up your three legs of your stool and added a fourth. Yeah. I think there's got to be that reason why. And Brad, this came about just as a result of our talking. Yeah. What is it what's this glue around the transfer of knowledge, skill, management, and ownership? And I think that's the why. It's the story. And in my view, stories are powerful. And so here we are, lawyers and CPAs, listening to Brad and I speak, and we really want to get down to where the rubber meets the road and talk about what role we ought to play in this process.
Yeah, and so while preparing for this presentation, I told Gene 30 years ago, I went to the NYU Tax Institute as a young lawyer in a room full of 300 other advisors. And a partner from a large law firm stands up and talks about the failure rate of 70%. And she points out in the audience and she says, you know whose fault it is? It's your fault, because you guys are so close to the clients that it's your responsibility to advise and work with the clients, because you are in a very unique situation to help the advisors. Now, no one, I never like to be told that anything's my fault, but the point was that we have an opportunity to help our clients identify how difficult it is, as well as help them develop a plan. So this is the hard part I see with many professionals, is that they know the 15% very, very well. What's that old saying? If you've got a 900-pound hammer, everything looks like a nail. But I would argue and suggest to you that to the extent that we can, as advisors, move into the 80%, we become better advisors, we improve our relationship with our clients, and helps us with the technical part, because we may uncover things that, had we known when doing planning, we change our plan. And so, these things go hand in hand. I think the closer and deeper you get into understanding not just the technical stuff, but those other issues, you can help prepare the client for their succession.
And so as we begin to deal with these areas in the 85% arena, and as I had indicated at the beginning, I approach this from the law side, from the technical side, from tax, understanding of entities and buy-sell agreements and what have you. And one of the stories that really stands behind this slide was when I was a baby lawyer. I was in with one of my clients, who is still one of my terrific clients and great friends. And he's a gentleman much older than me, but he's a fabulous business person. And he's got energy galore. But I was sitting in a meeting and we were talking about an upcoming transaction. And again, it was before any of this gray hair. And I made the mistake of offering my business advice and my advice about something outside the technical realm of the law. And he looked at me and very sincerely said, Gene, if I wanted you as a business advisor, I would hire you as that. You're a lawyer. Only focus on what I've asked you to do. And that was a wake-up call to me. And I realized, and after 20 years working closely with this client, being brought into family issues, I've moved to a position where now when I sit in meetings with him and his family, he oftentimes looks at me and says, well, what do you think beyond the law, but about the business issue, about the family issue, about the transition of this business. And so I say all that to say this. It's unless you're Brad, who is forward facing with his company and is brought in as the succession solution, for those of us on the technical side who don't hold ourselves out like that, it's a position that we have to earn. And so depending on where you are with your client will show that client's receptiveness to our opinions in this arena. And one of the things that makes this arena difficult, and we're going to talk about a few of these items, is the fact that our expertise is really in that bottom circle, the substantive law. We're trained as lawyers, we're trained as attorneys, we're trained as experts in the law. And dealing in the 85% arena requires that we deal with the people-centric side. And so it's traditionally not our field of study. And oftentimes relationships, they are emotionally charged. And a lot of times it requires that the clients reveal to us some of their dirty laundry. And so it does require a deep level of trust for them to share that dirty laundry with us.
Yeah, and if I can go back to what you said, Gene, because it is a difficult area to use your term, invited in. My experience has been when advisors, they don't say, hey, you should do this or you should do that. One suggestion I would say to the participants is prepare a list of really good questions, in the sense that, have you thought about your successor? Have you thought about a succession plan? What training? And sometimes when you just ask the question, that prompts the conversation. Just something to think about.
Brad, I like that because, questions are not offensive. It's not me saying you're doing something wrong, do this. It's, hey, have you thought about this? And it's a very easy, non-offensive way to open that door.
Yeah.
That's good.
And so the next slide, it's funny because this is a funny story. I had a conversation yesterday to this point. So it's, I'm stating the obvious, but it's important sometimes to state the obvious that we got to work together. We can't take these positions where it's my way or the highway because I came up with this idea. So it's really, really important. And that's when I work with clients, I want to find out who their CPA is, who their lawyer is, and speak to them. We have a situation where I'm doing a succession plan and we're working on reconstituting the board. And it's a very, very large client. And on the board, they've got two siblings that are fighting each other, right? And it's the CEO and his sister is not competent to be on the board. We're trying to bring in some professional advisors. So I developed this plan, and we get the lawyer of a law firm, one of the largest law firms in the world, and he starts, throwing up on it. And we're trying to look at answers. Hey, Brad, my job isn't to get solutions. My job is just to create problems, to identify problems. I said, okay, well, let's work on some solutions. Which at the end of the conversation, we got it right. But this is the point that we got to work together. So,
yeah, and one of the things I do, and I'm curious what you think about this, Brad, is I like the advisors to make their sausage, if you would, outside the earshot of the client. And I'll oftentimes, if I'm meeting with the CPAs or other consultants, I'll have one of the clients, one of the members of the family say, hey, can I join you? And I tell them, I really don't want you there because, one, I think because a lot of times, we practice in the arena of advice, we want to appear right. And so I think it changes the dynamic. Whereas if you get professionals who are well-intentioned, smart, they can work out their differences very openly and not feel like they're posturing in front of a client. So in my mind, that's an important aspect of doing this as you get on the same page. No, it doesn't mean that you only have one solution. You may have alternatives and your client, and you present them as a unified front of advisors and let the client decide which way he or she or they want to proceed.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that having a separate meeting without the client in the room, so all the professionals aren't pounding their chests, showing how big and strong they are, is an excellent way. And usually when you do that, they speak in a collective voice once they come up with a solution. So I think that's great advice.
Well, and one of the other things that makes this arena difficult is depending on when the family starts the planning, it's the number of relationships that are involved. And I love this formula because it succinctly shows how there's an exponential increase in the number of connections when you have a family that's expanding, and when you bring spouses in and grandchildren or children who enter adulthood. And so it's interesting when you've got three people involved, or if you have two people involved, husband, wife, there are two relationships. If you have three, there are three relationships. But then when you begin adding six, so maybe you have mom and dad and three kids. Well, now you've got 15 different relationships, and just look at the exponential growth. And so one of the things I often talk to families about when I begin going down this path is the fact that, look, part of the reason you have to be open with us is because of all these different connections that the family has. And there are going to be issues when you look at 20 people involved in 190 different relationships. That's a lot of emotion that we have to deal with and work around and be sensitive to.
And Gene, to your point, with respect to those numbers, the other issue that pops up is how many mouths there are to feed. When there was a company with one owner, he had one family. With 3 or 4 or 5, 6 different families. Now the dividend distributions change a little bit because there's more people to feed, and that makes it more difficult. So I think that's possible. So one of the things that I see with business owners is I call it the shutdown mode. They get so overwhelmed with all of the issues of succession planning, they go into shutdown mode and they do nothing, right? So some of the questions that I see a lot is, I don't know how much money I need for retirement. I'd read an article where you go from control income to contract income. What do I mean by that? As an owner, I can control my distributions. I can control my salary. When I retire or sell my shares to the next gen, now I'm in a contract mode, and that makes me nervous. I don't know what my number is. And I have literally asked clients, do you know what your number is? And they don't know. And that's where a financial advisor comes in. Who's going to be the next CEO? When do I start the process? I met with the board the other day, and they said, well, we could just start a year in advance. Wrong answer, right? How do I start the process? Am I ready to give up control? The one line that a business owner gave me, it's $1 billion business I work with. He said, Brad, I'm afraid of going from he's the man to who's he, right? And then, the process of exit. We talked about, we talked to clients about a controlled auction and hiring an investment banker. And then how do I determine the value of my business? This is not as difficult for the participants on this presentation. But for a business owner who's doing this for the first time, it can be overwhelming. And the little boxes, little balloons on the right side is, 90% of the business owner's net worth, that is the biggest asset on their balance sheet, is their business, right? So they got to get it right. And then, of course, 25% don't feel that management's ready to take over because no one can do it as well as them, right? And the 70%, they don't know what they need to retire. So these are really overwhelming issues that I think we need to be thoughtful and develop a process to help them peel this onion back and say, okay, let's one at a time. We'll figure out how much money you need. We'll develop a process. We'll start about the timing. And this is where I think we as professionals can help them deal with this issue a little easier.
Yeah, I find this especially true. I mean, all of this is true at each generational level, but when you have that entrepreneurial individual who grew the business, started it or caused it to grow and has no plans to sell it. I mean, their identity is so wrapped up in the business. I mean, it makes it difficult. And you've got to have the next generations be sensitive to that and respect the patriarch or matriarch, what they've done and what they've created for the benefit of the family, and making sure that that owner, the principal owner, is comfortable transitioning. The other thing that makes this a interesting arena, even though our tax laws change a lot, we know what they are. But when we enter the 85% arena, these people arenas, there's a lot of complexity around the family. Do you have the traditional, leave it to beaver type family where it's mom, dad, 2 kids or 2.5 kids, whatever the number is now? Or do you have kind of the new modern family where it's, spouse happens to be the age of the kids, where you have all these complexities? You've got addiction issues, mental health problems. There's more complexity also created on the basis of the business. I mean, if you've got a business that's entirely made up of marketable investment assets, that's fairly easy to split. You can push off management to a third party. And then you begin looking and working with operating businesses that may not be as easily divisible, and you have to have somebody who manages and oversees it. All that to say, as we enter into developing the plan and the process, we've got to realize there's not a monolithic solution. So we've got to be flexible, and we've got to be willing to react and think and work with the other advisors. And one of the things I like doing is okay, are there models of success, or is there some kind of archetype out there that we can look to? And I think one of those is the Enochians. The Enochians are based on Enoch in the Old Testament, who had a very long life. And so what the Enochians are, it was founded in 1981, and eligibility for membership is based on the longevity, performance, and financial health of a company. Every member of the Enochians Association has to have been in existence for a minimum of 200 years. It has to be a majority family owned, and at least one of the founding family members has to be engaged in the company, whether on the board or an officer. So when you look at the company membership makeup, you'll see that there are no U.S. Members of it. They're European, largely, some Asian. But it's, I think it's an important exercise to take a look at what they find makes them successful. And what's been found with the members of the Enochians Association is that all of them operate, all the members of them operate pursuant to an agreed upon protocol. In other words, written documentation that governs how the family and the business interact, and who can own shares, and how those shares can be sold, and how those shares can be transferred. In essence, they operate according to a written plan. And it's just not the Enochians that have this statistic. Brad, why don't you talk about what Cornell's done?
Yeah, Cornell, it's remarkable. They have a great program up there for succession and business owners. And they have found that when a written plan exists, only about 16% of the time is there a failure rate. When I was in law school a million years ago, the law school professor, the contract professor once said, writing is the highest form of thinking, right? Which, if you think about that, that's pretty insightful. And so when you put a document, a plan in writing, it helps you think through this process. So that's why I think it is really important.
When one of the things that we need to do is we need to understand client expectations and what their desires are. And so there are a few slides in here, and we won't spend a lot of time, but I think what you're going to see as we begin moving into putting the process in place is we have to understand what our clients, whether it's G1, G2, whoever it is that we're working with, or maybe it's a combination of all of them. What do they want, and what do they expect? And so that's a question that really drives this entire process.
Yeah, and I think this statistic, and we'll, I think, get into the process in a moment, but I think this is also helpful, was a PwC study that, no surprise, protecting the business as the most important family asset is overwhelmingly what's important to business owners. It's their other child. It's their identity. And most business owners want to keep it within the family. There's a legacy issue, and certainly there is income for the family. But I think this demonstrates that, my concern sometimes is back to that 900-pound hammer. An investment banker may want to tell somebody to sell the business, right, to get fees. And they come in with a certain bias. But most people don't realize that business owners, they don't want to necessarily sell their business. They want to keep it within the family.
Well, and it's interesting. They want to keep it in the business or keep it in the family, yet there's this resistance to change and professionalization. What do we mean by professionalization, Brad?
Yeah, so professionalization, how I view it, Gene, I do think it's important. It is creating a board of directors, having some independent people, not that they're in control, but they raise issues that maybe the business owners aren't aware of, challenge the thinking, and help them innovate. Marshall Goldsmith once said, "What got us here won't get you there." And that's the issue with publicly held companies as well as family businesses. They can't resist change. And so, if I can go back for 1 second,
Absolutely.
just with that statistic, it's interesting here that it says 30% have succession plans. And don't you think it's interesting that 30% have succession plans and 70% fail? There's a certain correlation in there. So,
Well, yeah, and you go back to one of our earlier slides, when you look through the numbers, 30% of families are successful. And those are, if you go then to the Enochians, all of them operate pursuant to a plan. So I think those numbers are strongly correlated and just prove the point that we're talking about.
Yeah.
So, Brad, how do we start?
Yeah, and the quote that I like to give, Don Shula, the famous football coach, once said, "It's the start that stops most people." Right. And so how you start, it's not your plan, it's the client's plan. The client has to decide what they want to do. And, just because you think it's a great company and you think they should transfer it down, they may want to sell it. I have a client that has been offered very attractive prices for their company. And he said, "Brad, I have a 100-year plan to keep it within the family. I promised my parents I would." And so it's not for me to say, "Yeah, but Jack, this is a great offer," right? We have to start with what the client wants. But I think you asked why. Can you articulate the reason? Now, in my client's situation, he articulated that he felt it was his responsibility to be a steward of this company and not just to liquidate it, because he was going to transfer it down to the family. So it's really the what and the why. And then we can talk about, once you identify what they want to do and why they want to do it, then you can help them develop a process.
Yeah, and I go back to your three-legged stool. The what and the why really is it's the story. It's that which everything is bound around and the family can buy into. And so as we begin turning to the process and the plan, when I'm working with the younger generations, a lot of them are familiar with the fables, and I think there's some great lessons out of those fables, and it's the hare and the tortoise fable here that's applicable, where this is not a sprint. This is not I'm going to do something for you, email it to you, or send you the hard docs, and we're not going to see each other again. This is a process. It's a living, breathing process that's continual. It's systematic. It's not a one-time event. It is difficult because, again, we're dealing with the human side of it. And again, as the family grows, that becomes more complex as you're dealing with more and more issues and problems. So it is a process that takes time, talent, and treasures. So, Brad, why don't you talk about what the process looks like?
Yeah. And Gene, to your point about you can't do this in one meeting, and sometimes people get overwhelmed. So one of the questions I will ask a client when I meet with them for the first time, I'll say, "Hey, Gene, we're sitting here 3 years from today. It's 2026. What would you like to see have happen with respect to the business and the succession?" And it takes some of the pressure off. "Oh, 3 years, that's plenty enough time." But I think that you've got to find a process. I just think the process that I have works real well. But you find a process, and it gets back to what we talked about. What's the purpose? What are we going to do, and why are we going to do this? If this is going to be a family business, then why? And then what are the core values and purposes, principles? Because I believe there will be arguments along the way. There will be conflicts. There will be challenges. And if we go back to our vision and our values, what we respect, this will be our foundation. Then the thing I talk about is, I joke, I say, finding your red dot. When I go to the mall and I need to get to a store, first thing I do when I go into the mall is I look for that big block and look for that red dot and say, "Where am I?" It's remarkable how many business owners don't know what they have with respect to their estate plan, their trust, the stock. And then probably the most important thing I think in this process is you say, "Okay, this is where you want to go. This is where you are. What are the challenges? What are the obstacles? What are the risks? What are the threats?" Because if there were no obstacles, you would be there already. Then Once you identify those obstacles and threats, and that's the hard part, getting that out on the table, those blind spots, keeping stuff back that you may be afraid to talk about, then you develop a plan. Okay, this is what we're going to do over the next 3 years. This is what we're going to do over the next year. And that's how you develop a process. And then lastly, of course, you've got to identify who's going to participate in this process. As I joke, you've got to come with batteries included. You can't just be a naysayer. You can't be a troublemaker. But you get those family leaders, you get the key employees, and then you get your advisors. And I really think that when you follow a process, your chances of success increase dramatically.
When did you talk about success? How do you define it?
Yeah. And so success, in my opinion, is achieving the client's objectives. So, to use an example, I'm unfortunately a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. We view success as, like any team, winning the Super Bowl. So if the business owner's definition of success is to successfully transfer this business down to the next generation so that the company is successful, the family is successful, the company continues, the family is working, the employees are protected. It's really the definition of the client, but then you have to I'm a big believer in an objective criteria. It's one thing to say, I want to lose weight, and I see you a year from now. Well, did you lose weight? Well, I lost 8 pounds, right? You need to have what I'll indicate, as many of you heard, key performance indicators. All right, we're going to have a board of directors in 3 years. We're going to create 2 classes of stock, and we're going to transfer 90% of the non-voting stock to the next gen. Those objective criteria where there will be no argument about whether we achieved it or we didn't achieve it, right? And this gets back to this, document. Then I tell people it's okay if we have an objective that we don't meet. It may not be that important after we did our deep dive into whether or not it was important or not. But if we're going to change, we need to understand why we're changing.
And in order for this to work, in my mind, there's got to be, the plan can't be developed by one person and imposed on the family. It's kind of like us, what Brad and I were talking about earlier. If we go into a client and say, you're doing this wrong, you have to do it this way, the client doesn't buy into that. And so this process has to be, it's got to incorporate shared values and vision of the family with respect to the business, because at one point in time, G1's no longer there. And so you want G2 to carry it on. And so the family's got to commit to it and buy into it. And I'll tell you, as kids get older and their children are involved in sports and other activities, it's harder to pull them back in for family meetings because they're busy, and if they have limited vacation time, they may not want to sit or spend their vacation time sitting, learning about stuff, working on the succession of the business. So they really do need to buy in. And part of that buy-in process, in my mind, is you need to have family leaders who will drive the process. And it's not necessarily the person who's running the business, because running the business may require a very different skill set than leading the family, because the person leading the family has his or her objective of trying to develop successive leaders who are focused on educating and developing and getting next generations to buy into this plan and this system. And we go back to the Enochians and what we've talked about. It needs to be written down. Again, you look at the statistics. Writing it down makes it much more likely that you're going to succeed. And these written plans, it's not just one piece of paper, but it talks about how the family works in the business and with the business, what their rights are. Do you have employment policies that require that family members work outside the business? What kind of ownership limitations do you have? It needs to address those different issues.
Gene, if I can interrupt for 1 second, back to your comment about writing it down. It's just not just writing it down. What helps when you write it down, there can be accountability, right? And so 3 years, someone's stepping outside the lines, and they say, well, I don't remember that. Okay, well, if you have a writing, there can be accountability. Yeah, we agreed to that. So it's a lot easier to hold someone accountable when there's a written document. Sorry for the interruption, Gene.
No, you're absolutely right, because we tend to remember things in a light that's most favorable to us. And if we haven't written it down, well, that's not what we agreed to. Yeah, it is. Here it is. It's on this piece of paper.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing you need to think about when we're talking about an operating business or family assets, there really are two governance structures at play. There's one around the family, getting them to buy in, getting them to understand, holding them accountable to the process that we've implemented. But then we've got to make sure that the business is running smoothly and right. It's adapting to the changing conditions. And so there's got to be a recognition that there are two spheres. It's unhealthy if they completely overlap, because not everybody can be involved in the business, especially as you move down in generation. And so one of the things that has to happen is you have to have communication between the family and the business, and the business and the family. And without that communication, people begin feeling disenfranchised. They feel like things are being hidden from them. So that's a hugely important matter. So I want to, in the interest of time, I want to talk about something. Brad and I talked about this, and he kind of liked this. This is an example I use and teach when I'm working with the family councils, and especially the younger generations. And that is the importance of making group decisions. And one of the things that happens when you make a group decision is well demonstrated by something called the Johari window. And basically, there are 4 quadrants when we are interacting with other people. There's this open area where the person, if Brad and I are working together, he knows something, I know something, that's the open area. But if Brad and I are working together and I don't know something, but Brad does, then that's a blind spot for me. And he can, if he so chooses, take advantage of me in that area. Well, the same is true down in the lower left quadrant where it's hidden. If I know something that Brad doesn't know, and I'm a bit opportunistic, nefarious, or whatever I want to call it, I can take advantage of him because he's not aware of the issue. But then there's this quadrant in the lower right-hand side where neither of us know about it. And it could be something that comes and bites us. So the goal of working together, and the goal of a family coming together, and the goal of a family sharing, the goal of advisors working together outside the presence of the client. Anytime we're in a group setting, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to expand that open area. Because again, as a family, as advisors, we have a common objective: make the business succeed. And so the only way that happens is when we begin sharing information and sharing it openly. So I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead a number of slides, and I'll leave this to your perusal. And I would ask that if you have questions about any of these slides, please feel free to contact us. So Brad, why don't we talk about our plan, our process versus reality?
Yeah, I mean, and so what did Mike Tyson say? Every plan works until you get punched in the face, right? And so that's why when I work with clients, I meet with them on a quarterly basis, because something's going to get in their way. There's going to be, he's touching me again. As Gene indicated here, we've got all these disruptors. You have to expect the unexpected.
And so, and these slides just kind of go through and list what various disruptors are. And, Brad had asked about this slide, and it's one that I find interesting from the standpoint of one of those disruptors is unrealistic expectations. And that's all part of this communication process that we have to deal with. And so part of the course correcting is looking at what happened to this wonderful straight line plan when reality strikes. And we've got to be, our clients have to expect it, and we've got to be willing to work around and work through it. So what I want to do next is, Brad introduced me to the 12 commandments of succession planning. And so what I'd like to do, Brad, why don't you walk us through these, and we can kind of talk through them as we get ready.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So Leon Danko, a million years ago, worked for Arthur Andersen. He is considered the father of succession planning. And some refer to his book as the Old Testament of succession planning. And I love these, right? And so, thou shalt share thy dream with thy family. You can't hide it. You got to let them know. I want to sell the business. I want to transfer it down. My son is incompetent. I want to name my daughter. You can't hide that. You have to inform, thou shalt inform thy managers and employees the company will continue forever. I will tell you, one of the biggest questions employees ask me when I work with them is, hey, I don't know what they're going to do with this company. Will I have a job, right? Create an org chart and make it visible, because that's how you can figure out what you need and who you need. You need to continue your management and that of the managers and the family. So it's all about education. Number 5, create an orthodox accounting system. I just worked with a client who had to stop his succession plan because his controller stole $1 million from him, right? You got to have a good accounting system. Number 6, thou shalt develop a council of competent advisors. Not get your buddy from the country club, but get good lawyers, CPAs. 7 is have a board of directors. He's a big believer in independence, or he was a believer. He's now passed away. And number 8, you got to choose your successor, as difficult as may be, and make sure that successor is prepared and well taught. And then you got to do it within your lifetime, right? You don't want to be taking out boots first. And then, 11, of course, is thou canst not take it with thee. So get your estate plan in order, and thou shalt apportion thy time to see that these commandments be kept. You have to dedicate time to this stuff. So I really think this compiles a lot of the stuff that succession planning is about. Gene, you want to comment?
No, I think it does as well. And I mean, we probably could have thrown this slide up and just talked through our entire presentation, our 51 minutes now. Yeah, and so I think it's a great tool to be able to share with clients. And again, it helps them understand the process and the journey that they're about to undertake. And as we wrap up, I can get the, I think Yogi Berra says everything. I mean, he maybe doesn't have all the quips that you do, Brad, but if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. And I think that also nicely summarizes what we're talking about.